attacks on Trump and the what just happened in Germany with the fascist march, and some of the points that he made, which I think are very important for all of us, because we know that in terms of this administration, it's like, you know, you're following a soap opera or something. Every day, people's attention is riveted by what's happening with the Trump administration. And some of it is just about him personally. What often gets lost in the shuffle is what are the overriding attacks on the working class that are being carried out, not just by Trump, but by his entire administration. And what Fred starts out his article saying this week is that many progressives are hoping that the establishment will take Trump down, and that is illusory. And it's true. I mean, for an awful lot of people, we don't have to go into all the crimes of Trump. They are legion, you know. But many, many people are opposed to him now, including even some that voted for him under the misinformation that he constantly gave out about what he was going to do. But the problem is not just Trump. The problem is Trumpism. And what Fred points out is that the political defeat of Trump would be important and may happen, but that it won't be fundamental, because it will not deal with, and this is how he put it, the racist, misogynist, xenophobic, national chauvinist forces that Trump has conjured up and consolidated into a reactionary base. So, and he said that base is not going to go away, whatever happens to Trump. That the workers and the oppressed will still have to deal with this reactionary mass that he has consolidated. And what will be needed in the future is to defeat Trumpism, not just at the polls, but on the ground. Now, Fred wrote this latest piece before the news broke yesterday that some of you may have followed, which I think totally confirm his analysis. There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times. It was not signed. And that's a departure from their usual journalistic approach. It was just anonymous, but the anonymous person was described as someone high in the Trump administration. And in that, this person just really lambastes Trump, which, you know, many in the media have been doing, but not for the right reasons, not at all. As a matter of fact, in that op-ed piece, this person high in the Trump administration says this, and this is a quote from it. "To be clear, ours is not the popular, quote-unquote, resistance of the left," to these people in his administration. "We want the administration to succeed and think that many of its policies have already made America safer and more prosperous." So they think that the policies of this administration have made this country more prosperous. You know which class they're talking about. The ones whose cream that they're skimming off the top has become so huge. And then this anonymous person goes on saying this: "Although he was elected as a Republican, the president shows little affinity for ideals long espoused by conservatives. Free minds, free markets, and free people." So you know where this guy's coming from, right? At best, he has invoked these ideals in scripted settings. At worst, he has attacked them outright. So what he stands for, and this opposition that the Times, you know, has put out there very prominently, is totally for the so-called ideals of the Republican Party, reactionary ideas, racist ideas, misogynist ideas, anti-immigrant ideals. Now, going back to what Fred had written, he said that given, now I think that's just, wait a minute now. No, I'm sorry. I'm not quoting from Fred here. Yeah, no, I'm not quoting from Fred here. I'm quoting from the same person that wrote for the Times. And he says, given the instability many witnessed, there were early whispers within the cabinet of invoking the 25th Amendment, which would mean impeachment, which would start a complex process for removing the president, but no one wanted to precipitate a constitutional crisis. So we will do what we can, his little grouping in the administration, right, to steer the administration in the right direction until one way or another it's over, meaning all the problems that they've had with Trump being so mercurial and, not understanding half the time what the heck the imperialists have set up in their own interests, and he's just like a bull in the china shop, right? So I think all of this really confirms what Fred is saying, that the idea that what Trump has done and the movement that he has evoked is going to be solved by this struggle in the ruling class it's a pipe dream. He points out that what Trump has done is he's opened the door to the extreme right, including outright fascists, as we saw last year in Charlottesville, and his response to that. And Fred goes on to say that the movement has recovered from this assault, and it's forced the removal of many Confederate statues, and that the Unite the Right movement seems to have been pushed back by because they called something after Durham, they have been pushed back because they called something and they didn't get hardly anybody there. But really, what's important in this article is that it goes over some of the history of what the U.S. ruling class has been capable of in relation to reaction. And he takes up the question of the history of racism in the United States, that going back to slavery, and the fact that the Civil War may have ended chattel slavery, but as he put it, there's been no attempt by the Northern capitalist class after the Civil War, after the defeat of Reconstruction, really, to purge the South of racism and racist officials. He says there's been no re-education campaign among the white population, no resources devoted to the anti-racist transformation of the South. The capitalists of the North were quite content to build the railroads and shipping lines and profit from the land slavery of African Americans. And he does all this, he says all this to remind us that the fascists, the right-wingers, the anti-immigrant racists of all sorts have been mobilized by Trump. And he's fomented anti-immigrant racism on a world stage. And this anti-immigrant right-wing trend has been reflected in Europe among fascist and pro-fascist forces as well. Indeed, Trump sounds much like the European right. So if you've been reading about what just happened in Chemnitz in Germany, which formerly had been part of East Germany, you'll know that the fascist movement there has been recruiting on the basis of many economic problems that are driving people into a frenzy. But this is what he brings up that's so interesting about Chemnitz and East Germany. He contrasts this present with the period after World War II, when there was Soviet occupation in the eastern part of Germany, and that occupation set the stage of for the formation of the German Democratic Republic. And he quotes not from a leftist source, really, but from Der Spiegel, which is a very bourgeois, sort of very conservative newspaper, where they said that the new government undertook a vigorous program. That was the new government in the East after the GDR was formed. It undertook a vigorous program of denazification, unlike what occurred in capitalist West Germany or the Federal Republic. In the capitalist West, high Nazi officials retained their positions and got official jobs, retained their pensions and got official jobs. And then Der Spiegel says, a total of 25 cabinet ministers in West Germany, one president and one chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, which was what post-war Germany in the West was known as, had been members of Nazi organizations. And that's the German bourgeoisie themselves admitting this about their own creation after the war. And an example is given of somebody named Bruno de la Motte. And no, he's not an example. He's somebody who wrote this a piece in the London Guardian, and he was not a socialist, but he was a German. He said, I was born and grew up in the German Democratic Republic. Our school books dealt extensively with the Nazi period and what it did to the German nation and most of Europe, unlike the education that people were getting in the West. This was the education they were getting in the East. During the course of their schooling, all pupils were taken at least once to a concentration camp, where a former inmate would explain in graphic detail what took place. All concentration camps in the former GDR were maintained as commemorative places so that no one should forget. The government itself included a good proportion of those, including Jews, who had been forced to flee Hitler fascism or who had been interned. This is all a quote from this guy from the East who had grown up in the East. In the East, thousands of new teachers had to be found overnight, as those tainted by the Nazi ideology were not suitable to teach a new post-war generation. And this resulted in schools having undertrained and inadequate teaching staff for some years. All lawyers were replaced too, so they didn't even have, this shows you how difficult it was to build up East Germany. They didn't have enough people who had been in opposition to the Nazis because they'd been killed, And that included teachers, it included lawyers, and so on. But in capitalist West Germany, thousands of leading Nazi army officers, judges who had sent Jews and leftists to their deaths, doctors who'd experimented on concentration camp victims, politicians and others were left unscathed and continued in their professions. So this is by way of, making people here understand where this increase in the trend towards fascists coming out openly as who they are is coming from today. It's coming from Trump and his ilk in Europe, and it's coming because of the fear, really, of the bourgeoisie. It hasn't happened yet, but the fear that there's going to be a big economic catastrophe and they're going to have to deal with the working class, and they're preparing for that. So, again, on what happened in Germany, when the Berlin Wall came down, that was supposed to be so wonderful. Remember? Some of you are too young to remember, but I'm sure you've read about it. It was built up as such a wonderful thing that the Berlin Wall had come down, and this was going to mean all democracy for all of Germany, right? And then came the return to capitalism in the East. And right from the very beginning, there were demonstrations against immigrants there. and Nazi and right-wing politics resurfaced, but this time in the form of anti-immigrant racism and xenophobia. So it's no surprise that 29 years after the restoration of capitalist exploitation, and with the creeping world economic crisis hitting Germany, including the youth and the petty bourgeoisie, the neo-fascist movement should take on the tone of a racist anti-immigrant crusade. And then he goes into how in the U.S., even more than in Europe, racism has always been the cutting edge of fascism in this country and political reaction. But we have to look, we look at all this very seriously, in other words, and we look at it from the point of view of the challenges before our class and why it's so important that we fight to unite our class against any form of oppression that divides us, because we have a hell of a nasty, rotten, murderous system to have to deal with. But we as Marxists, we know what the economic basis is for all this, and that's the deepening capitalist crisis of overproduction, which is a feature of capitalism and has been a feature of capitalism since the 19th century. And it always can sound sort of puzzling if you haven't studied any Marxism to think, well, overproduction, but when people don't have enough, how can there be overproduction? Yeah, well, it's overproduction because they can't afford to buy it. And overproduction is it's a cyclical thing with capitalism, and sooner or later, I mean, right now, the stock market is at a high. All the tax cuts for the rich have just propelled the system, higher and higher and higher. But it's like the higher you get, the harder you fall, right? When there's a crisis. And in the economic pages of bourgeois media, they're talking all the time, about the instability of the current situation, especially with the accumulation of enormous debt. I mean, the debt level, somebody else could probably talk about the figures better than I could, but the debt level is just at the most incredible point you can ever imagine, and it's government debt, it's personal debt. I mean, think of all the student debt there is in this country, and people's debt for their homes, so that any kind of a crisis, has a potential of snowballing, and it would become an financial and an economic crisis. So that's what's creating Trump's base, and that's what's creating the base for fascist movements in Europe too. The capitalist economy, even now, and even while it's in an upswing, can't provide jobs for everyone. The productivity has become too high. They're cutting government jobs at the same time that jobs in the private sector are, they claim it's low unemployment, but we know that those figures don't represent the reality of what workers are going through around the country. That if you have a part-time job, and you only work a few hours a week, and you bring home nothing practically, you're counted as working. So let me just end up with this. It's all this is a recipe that we know for a much greater struggle that's looming, and it's the duty of all revolutionaries in the working class to combat and defeat the so-called populists. We can't rely, and we have to, win over people who are hoping that there's some kind of progressive current within the establishment that's going to reverse all of this. But we got to show them that that's not going to happen. That's not what's going to happen. The right wing is directing the anger and frustration of especially the middle class, the people who, and by the way, don't forget, a lot of the middle class are people who were workers at one time, and they bought into the idea that you could become an entrepreneur by, setting up a little business, maybe even an online business or something. That was a big thing about 30 years ago. Well, the working class, they're becoming more middle class. Well, there are a lot of people who were working class who went into the middle class, and they find it very, very precarious, and they're very, very worried. But because they're not directly in the working class, where they're in competition with one another, they don't have the same tendency towards solidarity as the working class. They're more susceptible to the right-wing propaganda and moving in the direction of fascism. So we're not a lot of this we talk about fascism and as the policies as the way in which a lot of things are carrying out. It's not that we have fascism as the ruling group right now. We'd be in a very different situation if we had. We wouldn't be able to meet here, for one thing. But it's looming. The dangers are looming. They're there. And right now, we're in a progressive period. I feel it. Despite all that I've been talking about, this has been a progressive period. I mean, you can see a lot of people are waking up to the need for the struggle. And we just have to, win them to the idea that the only way that this will ever be brought to an end is through the revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of capitalism and the working class coming to power.